This is Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal on the edge of Mount Everest country. Until recently, Nepal, a small nation of some 8 million people, was called a closed kingdom because its frontiers were rarely opened. Now foreigners frequently mingle with Nepali on the streets. 10 years ago, under the pressure of invading Chinese communists, streams of Tibetan refugees fought their way across the mountains to find freedom and refuge in India, and here in Nepal, a country of temples where Hinduism and Buddhism meet. Altogether, 8,000 of them came to Nepal, 500 of them settling west of Kathmandu at the south end of the Pokhara Valley. And here, 3 young Englishmen helped them to build a new life in Operation Tibnep.
Tibnep was our cable address. It was a very grand thing to do. Almost our first move was to make a cable address. It, I think, gave us a little bit of confidence right from the start. Tibetans in Nepal. It came to mean a lot more. It came to mean that fourth person, I think, which was there with us all the time in Nepal. Each one of us had something to contribute to this work. And together we made something bigger than any one of us. And this was Tibnep. The whole idea, the whole concept, the thing that really made it go.
On graduating from Cambridge, the 3 young men arrived here to find the Tibetans despondently squatting in a field. They were fighting to preserve their national identity and culture, and they were struggling for their life under conditions which were completely unfamiliar to them. The host countries had very little to offer. Sometimes the local people were living in a state little better than the refugees. But they offered what it was in their power to give: land, a place of refuge. But without help from outside in the shape of money and initiative, these people had no future.
The people in our community were mostly nomads, and they had roamed the steppe land, the grassland of Tibet for centuries. And when the Chinese came into their country, obviously these movements and this way of life was stopped. And I think probably more than anything, a nomad likes his independence. They rode horses, they walked, and they brought with them their yak herds. They came in quite large groups and came, unfortunately, uphill into the high Himalaya mountains. And it was here that they really met their first problems, because their yak died in the snow of the high mountains, and this is why they became so destitute.
On the left, John Pierce, on the right, David McPherson, and in the center, Roger Catchpole.
I think we first learnt about them when we were running a holiday for the Tibetan children in the Pestalozzi Children's Village. So this was our first meeting with Tibetans. There are about 25 Tibetan children there with their house parents and Lama. But the person who really told us most was the Dalai Lama's sister, Pema, who was there at the same time. She told us about the plight of the people in Nepal and in India, and the 3 of us were there together. We talked about these problems. We'd had a little bit of experience with refugees in Austria during our summer vacations at Cambridge, and we decided in 1963 that we would go in 1965. The money was coming from Geneva, from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This was for the major part of this rather large resettlement scheme, for the housing, for business projects, for dispensary, for school and things. But obviously that is only the bare bones of a project like this. Many other organizations contributed during the project as it went on. Many organizations in England contributed.
When we arrived at the camp, we realized very early on that we would have to live in it to try and understand these people. It would have been no good to continue to live up at the Pokhara airport where we had our first base. We were too much outsiders from there. So we decided to build a bamboo house inside the camp and to live amongst the people.
The refugee camp, I don't think was really as bad as we had imagined it might be on first sight. I think perhaps this was, our view of it was influenced by the amazing surrounding of the Pokhara Valley, the wonderful high mountains going up to almost 27,000 feet in our direct view. It was a very beautiful scene all round. I think it was only when we really started looking into the place that we found how really bad it was. All the real problems were inside the tents, not outside them. The first task was to settle ourselves into the camp and to find out exactly what we had there, to get to know the people and to investigate exactly who they were and what they were. And this took a long time, asking questions. Very quickly we decided that we must divide our efforts up. David and I have both been teachers, so we both put our efforts into developing a school in very close liaison with the Tibetan Lama here. We got some Nepali teachers in so that that subject could be taught. John has been a social worker in England, a training, and he set about going into the homes and finding out about the people, making a complete survey of the people, what they could do, what their troubles were, what their problems were.
The major thing which came out of the survey, I think, was firstly that the people, these nomadic Tibetans, came from all over Tibet. They weren't a unified group in any way. There were a lot from the east and a lot from the west and many from the south. And that they had adopted the Tibetan army system of organization as refugees in this camp. And this meant that the 500 people were split into groups of 100 people, each with a chief of 100. Within each 100, there were groups of 10 people, each with a chief of 10. And over the top of all this, there was one main chieftain. So they did have their own system of administration, which they'd adopted from the Tibetan army. The second factor which emerged from the survey which we made was that these nomadic people, whose nomadic way of life was completely lost forever, did have certain skills which could be quite nicely translated to the new settled way of life, this sort of urban situation, if you like, in which they found themselves. Many of the women could weave quite attractive cloth. They could spin wool and yarn. The men could make boots. Many of the men had been traders and knew a little bit about trading. They could read and write, some of them, and make quite amazing calculations in their minds. There was an artist, an old monk who'd been in a monastery for some years, and he could paint quite nice pictures. And he knew somebody else who knew how to make little model yak and clay masks. And so there were certain skills there. Some people had been farming in the north and knew how to use a plough and had done some sowing of seeds. So there were some skills which could be adapted quite well. And so there was a basis to build some sort of settlement for these nomadic people on. And the third factor which emerged from the survey was the fact that they had really gone through fantastic privations and difficulties during the previous years, and that although the camp looked rather nice visually when one first walked into it, inside the houses there was great health problems particularly. Mentally they had achieved that mentality which is sometimes called a refugee mentality. They'd almost given up hope, and they were just squatting in this field. They had come from Tibet and they were facing a new diet. In Tibet they had a very high protein diet. Now they were faced with a basic diet of rice. In Tibet it had been cool at an altitude of about 12,000 feet. Now in Pokhara, a subtropical valley, they were at an altitude of about 2,500 feet. And suddenly stomach disorders, dysentery, diarrhea hit them very hard. TB, and these hit the children particularly hard. 17 babies died during one monsoon. And so this was the third factor, that the people were very weak.
I think the most difficult problem that I had to face was persuading the people that it was in their interest to cut off the supplies of American food rations which they were being issued with. We had to try and show them that they would never be an independent community until they could exist without this outside help, which was not a very stable source of supply. And I know that we managed to cut off this supply gradually and retain their friendship. And this, I think, was a great achievement.
The first thing, obviously, was to get the people healthy, and the Nepal Red Cross supplied the proper medicines and things for the people. We tried to get the children washed, and this system of regular washing, in fact, has tended to spread through the people. So it was simple things to start with. Then we set our minds to the economic future, to the big building project which UNHCR are financing. There were obviously problems with the people when we first came. They had been wandering about in the north for many months, some for several years. They came down here and they didn't work to start with. So we tried to get them to realize that they had to do a hard day's work if they were going to succeed here. They began to work slowly. A few of them had been working when we arrived, just 20 out of 500. But they started to work, in fact, to improve the conditions of the encampment for the coming monsoon. We also managed to encourage more of them to work on the roads. The Indians are building a road from Pokhara to the Indian border, the first link of Pokhara with the outside world. And as they started to see money coming into their pockets, they were encouraged to work more. They enjoyed it. And then obviously we started to build the community, and this was a really big thing. They were starting to build their own homes. They learnt quite well. Obviously the younger people learnt better than the older people. One or two of them had been handymen. They certainly knew how to wield a hammer. Most of them didn't though. And it was very interesting watching them using a shovel. There is a definite technique of using a shovel, and most of them hadn't a clue how to even dig up a few stones. But we started an apprenticeship scheme, and we got Nepalis in to build the houses and at the same time to teach these young Tibetan men to become masons and carpenters. And once we had Nepalis working alongside the Tibetans, then the Tibetans learnt very quickly by watching. I don't think they would have learnt well in classrooms or in a very technical surrounding, but just by the practical business of sitting, watching, and seeing things happen. They picked it up quite quickly.
We were in no position of real authority, and the basis behind our work all the time was to work with the people and work. They had things to offer us. They had ideas to offer us. They had been sitting in the field for a year and knew something about the problems there. We were new. We had to learn. We had to learn from them, from local people. We had to pool our knowledge and together make decisions. And we did this through a series of committees, we called it. It's a rather grand name, but it meant that all those involved, the Tibetan leaders, ourselves, and sometimes the Nepali people, would get together and discuss things and arrive at a decision which was mutually acceptable and we hoped understood by everybody.
In a typical day, we would get up not as early as we would like. We'd be woken up by the cacophony of noise from dogs and chickens and prayers going in the camp, and particularly the school children praying just outside our house. The school was next door to our house, and they started up 3/4 of an hour chanting, rather too early for us. And then Tundup, our cook, would have prepared breakfast for us, usually a chapati and omelette. And we discussed what we were going to do during the day. We divided up the work amongst the three of us, dispensary administration, teaching in the school, supervising the construction and so on. And we'd discuss what problems that we were going to have. And then we'd meet up again at lunchtime. And again, we'd discuss what problems we'd overcome, and we'd go and divide up the afternoon's work. We had divided up the work amongst the three of us in fairly long-term chunks, about three months at a time, and then we would change the work round. So all of us at one stage or other had done every part of the camp administration. I think one of the great things about our time there was the way that the three of us managed to live together. We were all living together in one small room, little bamboo hut about 15 foot square. And we were there together for 18 months with short periods when we went away for holidays. And yet we never had any very serious rows amongst the three of us. And we managed to sort out all our problems quite amicably by discussions. We had a sort of troika system where the three of us discussed everything together, and it was usually a unanimous decision that resulted from this. But if anybody disagreed, then he always backed down, and we pulled together like that.
Many of these people had not seen Europeans until a few years previously. And to have Europeans living in the middle of their camp, living in almost the same way as themselves, was rather odd, and they wondered why we had come and what we were there to do and what we were going to get out of it. But slowly the essential friendliness and good-natured qualities of the Tibetan people came through very, very strongly. And we felt over the time that we had some very close relationships and some very good friends amongst the people. People would just wander into our house and stand looking, and they'd take you by the hand and drag you off to look at their house, and you'd sit in their huts and drink a cup of Tibetan tea, and one felt almost at one in this situation.
The most difficult physical conditions were I think the weather and the food. We had been talking an awful lot to the Tibetans about the monsoon, and we were quite unprepared for the ferocity of the rain, and I think we probably got the wettest of anybody to start off with in the monsoon. During the first rain shower, we all went outside with shovels and started feverishly trenching our house. We'd been pressing the Tibetans to trench their houses for the last 2 months, and we were caught totally unprepared, and the water just slooshed through the floor. It came through the ceiling, through the bamboo mats, and we were pretty wet that monsoon. We encouraged the Tibetans to wash by going to wash fairly regularly ourselves. Fortunately, there was a lake fairly near, and we used to go along to the lake and wash in the lake and at the dam or in the water channels that led to the paddy fields. We made the mistake of going for too long without a break, and that is when John and Roger became ill, and we all became a little bit depressed. But after 2 or 3 weeks away on holiday, you felt like coming back and really getting into it again. We were in a difficult position halfway between the Tibetans and the Red Cross and United Nations, because I don't think they quite understood the role that we were trying to play with the Tibetans. We were not there as commandants, we were there as advisors, and simple instructions from Kathmandu weren't quite so simple when we had to explain them to the Tibetans. There was a language problem, and we never wanted to give the Tibetans straight orders. We wanted to try and show them what was the best way to tackle a problem, and through this advice get them to come to the decisions, because this is what they would have to do as soon as we'd left.
We hired an interpreter because none of us can speak Tibetan nor Nepali. Over the period of 2 years, we did develop a few words of Tibetan and fewer words of Nepali, but we were dependent on an interpreter for the whole 2 years. And our interpreter was the son of a Tibetan nomad chieftain himself, who had received some education at a Swiss school in Nepal. And he was a young boy of about 16 and a half, 17 when he came to us. And we were very fortunate in that he himself, as a nomad, could really understand the people. And he could interpret what they were saying to us. Because it's not a question of interpreting the actual words, because Tibetan nomads talk in stories, and stories about yak and about sheep and about goats and about Tibet. And if it were just translated word for word, we wouldn't have understood a thing.
David noticed that Nepalis planted rice on even the smallest scrap of tillable land, and he thought, if they can do it, why can't we? Because the Tibetans were nomads, most of them had little or no experience of farming. So we brought in Nepali to teach the Tibetans how to plow and plant, and encourage them to make rice fields out of what little land they had. With money from Norway, we bought oxen and farm equipment. In late July, when the monsoon rains came, the plow team set to work turning the land into a thick, muddy soup. David joined the Tibetan farm group to learn the intricate balancing techniques of leveling the surface before planting.
The jump from nomadic existence to an urban existence in Nepal presented huge problems, because Nepal's economy is essentially agrarian, and there was not sufficient land for the Tibetan people to assume the same type of economic background. And we felt that it was a good idea to use some of the indigenous skills which the people had to develop into a business. Now, this jacket, for example, with the braid here and the Tibetan sheep's wool cloth, these jackets were actually given to us by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But we do make similar things in Pokhara. And this is the type of weaving which the Tibetan women can do. Well, we started with 5 people sitting on a bamboo mat, 5 old women sitting on a bamboo mat outside in the middle of the camp. And they spun some wool and they wove some coats, and we found that they did sell. We found that we could make shoulder bags and boots. And with slight adaptations, these lines could be developed to suit a European tourist's taste. And so we set up a shop up at the airport. The shop was actually in a hotel which the Business Projects Committee had established. And gradually the business developed until now, down at the new village, there is a large workshop which employs about 50 people. And things have actually been exported to Europe. The religious life of these people was fairly simple. They were very conscious of their religion. One heard Om Mani Padme Hum all the time, continuously, throughout the night, throughout the camp. The old people were spinning their prayer wheels. The old people used to have a prayer meeting, if you like, in the middle of the camp at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Although I was told that they spent half the time praying and the other half of the time reminiscing about Tibet. The people had built a wall of holy stones in the middle of the camp, and they all often walked around this wall, fingering their prayer beads. It was very definitely a part of their existence. I think in some ways it was, for them, the only link left with Tibet and with their country.
Their religious leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and some of his people, was given refuge by the Indian government at Dharamsala in the mountains near Kashmir. Here he has shown that the remote God King has measured up to being human and to being the religious and secular leader of a people in exile. The Dalai Lama is treated with great reverence, but he himself has no exalted ideas about his own divinity. He is aware that he has a culture to defend.
Indian leaders like Nehru and Shastri have shown us great sympathy, and the same applies to the Indian people. There is a brotherly relationship among us because of centuries of association between our peoples. The obstacles and difficulties are, of course, manifold in a strange country, but so far we are content with our experience. As the main reason for our flight was religion and culture, we do everything possible to preserve these values here in exile. That is why we try to preserve our identity when settling here. That is also why we have founded our own Tibetan schools.
The education of the children developed fairly quickly. We started off under a tree with just circles of stones for classrooms. Although this was a very wonderful classroom, perhaps the most beautiful classroom in the world, looking out over the Himalaya range, as the monsoon came, obviously we couldn't sit in this field any longer. So we were forced, in fact, to build our first permanent school made of bamboo. So we quickly moved into school building. We had good communications with our helpers in Kathmandu of the educational side. So we got money through quickly for this. We got equipment through quickly. We had a very fine young Tibetan teacher who really felt for the children and desperately wanted the educational side to go. So the scene was set for quick development. As it got on, as we got our timetables, as we separated the children out and got a few advanced classes, we realized that the Nepalis were also very interested in the education side. They wanted to help from the top. We went off and looked around the Nepali schools, the high schools in the town. And we found that the headmasters there were very interested in taking some of the boys and girls. So here was an incentive for our brighter children. When we left, some of those boys and girls were then sitting with Nepali children learning in the same classes in high school.
We are hoping to collect enough money to bring 2 of the more advanced children for a full year's further training in Britain. The new school had high priority in the building program on the site of the new village, and it was opened with some ceremony by a local dignitary of Nepal Red Cross. Nepali carpenters had taught Tibetans, and they worked together as we watched the village grow. At last the houses were ready with their tin roofs, and we were able to look out over the old site, now completely cleared of the bamboo huts and tents. A procession formed and the people walked together to their new homes, named by the Dalai Lama Tashi Ling, Happy Place. It had its own general store, cafe, clinic, nursery school and workshops, and soon the first gardens began to appear. At last, after 2 years, it was time for us to say goodbye, the job done. Some of the people came with us to Pokhara airfield, and Lobsang Gyaltsen, the teacher, gave us each a prayer scarf, the traditional Tibetan token of greeting and farewell. There was a great deal to think about as we left, but perhaps the most striking thing for us was that we had walked into a field full of tents, and we were leaving behind a village of stone houses. Our immediate hopes for the people, for the community, for Tashi Ling, as the new village was called, were that they would be able to, over the next few years, consolidate their position in Nepalese society and establish themselves at the level of the local people, so that in any future development of Pokhara, they can really go forward with the general development.
I think perhaps to sit in the meetings of the multi-purpose cooperative society of Tashi Ling, Happy Place, and to be able to sit back at last and hear people coming up with ideas, Tibetans coming up with ideas, and also see a Nepali sitting there with them and discussing these ideas freely, without any tension or strain. This had taken a long time for us to be able to do this. It was a very difficult phase for us. For a long time they tried to draw us into these meetings and to try to make us go on providing the incentive and the initiative. But by the end, they were coming up with the ideas and they were running their community. And this was tremendous.
I left 6 months earlier than John and Roger, and I was still very nervous about the future of the community. But I think perhaps because I was most concerned with the health of the community, I was able to look back with pleasure on the great increase in the health standards, partly due to improved diets, I think mainly due to better hygiene. The children, we'd started with the children, trying to clear up some of the basic ailments, the sores and the internal troubles, and also with the children started regular washing, and this had spread through the whole community, and there was a tremendous feeling of life about the community which hadn't been there when we first came.